So that's the most important message I always have is don't go at this just from your intervention. So I think what we have in companies, if you're in compliance, you have a bunch of interventions. You have your code, the rules you can write, you have your training so you can organize, you have your sort of reporting mechanisms, and maybe there's internal sanctions. I'm just summarizing a couple of examples. I flip it around. I say, okay, let's understand the root causes of this behavior here. What were the sort of mechanisms at play? There I would start normally with what enabled the behavior to exist anyway. So that's very practical. So you then don't ask why it happened, you ask how it happened. And if you understand the how, you may be able to cut out one of the necessary conditions for the behavior to happen.
That was Benjamin Van Rooij. He's the co-author of the Behavioural Code, How the Law Makes Us Better or Worse. So much more to come in this amazing episode. Welcome to Insights from the Coalface, elevating leadership beyond the boardroom. I'm Sarah Cole, a former solicitor turned life coach and founder of Cole Forums, the peer support network for CEOs and general counsel. This podcast is your exclusive access to high-trust conversation designed to inspire and empower leaders like you to thrive not just professionally but personally. In each episode, we'll delve into the challenges and triumphs of leadership, offering actionable insights and strategies to help you navigate complexity, foster resilience, and achieve authentic growth. Let's get started, and together we'll take your leadership beyond the boardroom. Benjamin Van Rooij is Professor of Law and Society at the Faculty of Law, University of Amsterdam, and Global Professor of Law at the University of California, Irvine. He studies and teaches about the interaction between law and behaviour, including effective enforcement, communication, toxic corporate culture, and assumptions about behavioural change. He is the co-author of the Behavioural Code, How the Law Makes Us Better or Worse, and co-editor of the Cambridge Handbook of Compliance. Benjamin, thank you for joining us.
So happy to be here.
I'm delighted because obviously I saw you at an event last year and then I absolutely realised that this was such an important topic. I can't believe really how little we know about behaviours, given that we're dealing in managing behaviours or trying to manage behaviours every day. It's a bit crazy when you think about it. What I'm interested in, though, is if we dig back into your early influences, how did you get into this space? It's really interesting.
So my original training was in law. So I was trained as a lawyer.
Prizes, charities, quangos and government task forces, and has served on a range of public, private and third sector boards and advisory boards. He was awarded an OBE for his services to business in 1994 and a CBE for his services to disability in 1999.
I was going to make my pitch to sort of compare administrative, private law and criminal law regimes and environmental law and do sort of a legal analysis. And then he started to talk about, before I could make my pitch, about, well, you go to Beijing, if you hear something interesting, you get on a train to Guangzhou. And when he said it, I was like, sold. And so before I knew it, I was in Beijing talking to environmental law enforcement officials and hearing about campaigns going on locally. And after a while, I went to Southwest China. And the more I dug into it and the more I interviewed local civil servants enforcing the law, the more I understood that whatever law there existed in Beijing, which was loads of it, just didn't work at all like we thought it did. And after a while, I wanted to sort of test what I understood about the enforcement part of it by interviewing companies. And as I got into that, and also interviewing the people living next to companies, so farmers, I more and more drifted towards this social science side of it, which I never wanted in the first place. And it led me to really understand how silly it is, especially in a country like China, to sort of have this paper law idea on an issue as important as environment without understanding the actual what's happening on the ground side of that. Coming back from China, I realized this isn't just the case in China. So I saw more and more that it's a similar thing happening in the Netherlands. So my own path, going from a purely legal analysis, which is very comfortable. You control the sources, you understand the analysis, you have all these assumptions on what it does, but you never need to test them. towards a social science empirical world, which is messy, which is not comfortable, where there never is a definitive answer, where there never is a true knowing or understanding of cause and effect. That has been my journey. And that also led me to a path in trying to um, disseminate sort of the knowledge I learned on the journey towards a more legal audience, as far as I can do that.
Do you think that must have given you quite an edge, really, because you understand where or how lawyers think, if you like, and it's often very risk averse, and it's all the things that we, stereotypically think of when we think of a lawyer. But it's also, I noticed in most of your writings that I saw, you're constantly looking for the evidence, the empirical data to back up these ideas. And I think that makes it very persuasive from the perspective of the people listening to this show, who will be lawyers and CEOs. And I think the way that resonates with that audience is probably what sets you apart from other people in this arena. Is that what you've found? Is that why there's such a good reception for the books that you've written, do you think, like the Behavioural Code?
So I think the core thing is I'm very pragmatic. And because if you look at the other side, the pure social science side to this, a lot of it is testing theories and sort of competing theories, and people are in their theories. And I don't care about anybody's theory. I just care about what is the best available knowledge out there. And often it comes from multiple theories, multiple bodies of empirical work with multiple sorts of sources. So that's one side to this, which I think lawyers have as an advantage. They're very pragmatic, and we're not married to any theory. So I think that's a good thing. We're in a way very interdisciplinary. Going back to the law side, I think understanding sort of where practice is and where the knowledge can be applied is an advantage. I think there's a lot of social science that's just so theoretical or so far distanced from reality. So there's a lot of people, for instance, doing game theory experiments about corruption. And academically, that's great. But I think truly bribing somebody or accepting a bribe is something very different than having a couple of students in a lab playing a game. So I think sort of being in between those worlds and being a translator between those worlds has been my advantage. That said, I do see that what the world of practice wants, which is a clear evidence towards a solution that you can even measure, just isn't going to happen and isn't there. So I see there's a lot of overpromising. I see sometimes there are social scientists who have a quick fix. I just don't believe in that at all. I believe in the better questions and the honest questions. And I really believe in going into the underlying causes. And then we get to, you mentioned lawyers and CEOs. I think the hardest thing is that the things where we know the underlying causes are, as far as I understand, are not within the purview of most people that are in compliance. They are in the C-suite, but they're very hard to sell there. That's maybe a deeper conversation we can have later, but that's sort of where I'm now. I used to start to think, if we just have the science, everything will be better. I'm now at a point where I really believe, A, the science doesn't point always to clear directions. And where it does, in the deeper underlying problems, it is maybe not the things we can touch very easily because they're so expensive and difficult.
Yeah, I think C-suite are always looking for certainty, right? And obviously a solution to a problem. So that's quite interesting to me. I mean, how you balance your role as a professor and academic, and then how you're navigating, say, academic cultures. Because I know you've written about Europe and the US, and that's quite an interesting side of you to me as well. How does that come about that you are looking at it so cross-culturally, do you think?
Well, so first of all, I spend a lot of time in China. So China is like a second home. So that already makes me bicultural or bicontextual in looking at these problems. I naturally have a Dutch and a Chinese lens. And then a lot of the literature is about the US, and I spent prolonged periods there, first at NYU teaching there for half a year, and then we spent 5 years in California. And there I was also teaching legal ethics, so you get even deeper into legal practice. I met a lot of different types of lawyers. And in that classroom, I increasingly saw other sides than just the corporate side. I met a lot of prosecutors who would be talking about how they reduce crime. And I would confront that sort of with what I was learning empirically from criminology about this. So it's really made me go through these sort of three diverse contexts, which I think a comparative angle helps as well in understanding some of these issues.
If I can just dig down into that sort of leadership side of things, because I know obviously the listeners are thinking of it from their own perspective. How are you defining effective leadership then from your own experience?
The leaders I know through experience are in the academic realm, and we can have a whole conversation about that. But I'm pretty sure that's not of interest to your audience. The sort of leadership I study, I have to say, I understand it best in the negative cases. So my new book, which I nearly finished the first draft, and I'm co-authoring it with Nick Lord, who's at the University of Manchester, a white-collar criminologist. It's called Toxic Organizations Gone Bad. And it describes the organizational processes behind structural harmful behavior emanating from organizations. It's the exceptional organizations that sort of start off okay. I mean, they're not organized crime, but at some point they come to be engaged in structural harmful conduct, whether it's financial, ecological, it can be health affecting, it can also be safety affecting. And there I do see that leadership plays an important role. So I understand a lot about the negative parts of leadership. And these are the sorts of things. The most important one is setting unrealistic targets. This is going back to what I said, talking about the sort of elephant in the room that we're not talking about. If you can trace a lot of the negative behaviors back to organizations at some point going off the rails in what they seek to achieve. So a very famous case is Wells Fargo. So you see that leadership at the bank at Wells Fargo at some point started this campaign this target to sell 8 products per customer, while the industry average was, I think, 1.8 at the time. So they went 4 times beyond what was the industry average. And obviously, organizations need to be ambitious. So that's an important thing. I do believe that a lot of the underlying causes of bad behavior actually has to be there to a certain extent. But they went so far in that direction, knowing and also having signals that couldn't be achieved, and ignoring then the signals when they came up, and actually incentivizing this further. And this goes from the top where it started to regional officers that were in competition with each other, that then copied each other's sort of ways to achieve these targets, that really got the individual bankers to start to open fraudulent accounts or unauthorized accounts. And that's maybe not the worst case in terms of the damages. There were some damages. But if you look at other cases where this has happened, for instance, at Boeing, what you see at Boeing is that the sort of targets became very cost-cutting and profit-oriented on the short-term profit, which is sort of irrational if you're an airplane manufacturer, that at some point you're cutting so deep into the cost that it is affecting safety, and you know of it. So that's a very interesting thing. And leadership, it's not only leadership, but leadership plays a vital role in setting those targets. So that's at least one important thing. Another thing to say about bad leaders, I always find it easier to talk about bad than I do about good, which is an evidence thing. We know that bad happened. We're never sure something is good. It may look good, but I don't know if it's good. I know it's bad, and I can then find out what's bad about it. So what you see at a case like Boeing is that when new leadership came in after the merger with McDonnell Douglas, they changed the sort of goals they were after, and in a sense, they changed the culture. Boeing only became successful because they were the first aircraft manufacturer that manufactured commercial jet airliners that were safe. I mean, the first one that created a commercial jet airliner was a British company, de Havilland, but their planes blew up. And the Boeing 707 in the 1960s, in the late 50s, they conducted 1,000 tests for the pressure cabin at immense cost. Why? Because they prioritized safety. And in the mid to late 1990s, this changed. It became all about the following the stock price. And the aircraft was no longer called the aircraft, it was called the box. There's very good documentation of how leaders, both from the top to lower, changed this.
I remember seeing a documentary about that actually, and it was all of the people at Boeing saying how the quality control literally fell off a cliff, compared to the standard they'd had before, which totally makes sense given what you've just said.
So if you're asking me what a good leader is, I would say, based on this, I would say a good leader is a realist. Maybe an ambitious realist, but a good leader is definitely a realist if you're looking at this. The second thing I would say about this is, look, if you want to be really ambitious and if you want to set targets that go beyond where everybody else is, fine. You probably need to do that. Otherwise, you get no innovation. But then you need to ensure that people can speak out and that you listen to them if things go wrong. So what I see happening in these toxic organizations is they both have unrealistic targets and people cannot speak out or they're not listened to. And again, leaders play some role in that, not a full role. And it's these two things that are sort of balancing each other. And you know about both things. You know that you're there when you're going beyond ambition. And you also know, or you should know, sort of, okay, do you actually um, respond to signals? That's one thing where sciencing happening. Do you have too much consensus? I mean, do you organize your own opposition? It's a vital thing, I think, for leadership, especially in a position of high ambition and low realism. And it's a really negative cocktail if you get high ambition at levels that probably you shouldn't be at, where you're not organizing your own opposition. So I would say a realist that's not afraid of critique. That would be for me the core things of a good leader that then can combine it with all the other things we know about successful leadership. But from a compliance point of view or a safety point of view, I would say we need that underlying realism and organizing of your own sort of a sort of critical input. And those things, I mean, I'm a sort of a leader as well. I'm director of research at my law school. I know how hard it is to do both things. It's very easy to fall back in big words and ambition, and nobody likes critique. Nobody. That's a human thing.
So are we saying that if we're a leader and we want to implement some really stretching, ambitious targets, let's say, we need to be really confident that our culture is solid and that we have the opportunity and the openness to critique and speak up about things. Is that the balance then?
Yes, but I would go a step further. So first of all, I wouldn't use the word culture there. It's too general. It can be. I know everybody's using it. The deeper I study it, the deeper I study it, the more I think how problematic it is because it hides actual things. And yes, we could actually study it, but then it's way more complex than people make it out to be. In my new book, I also discuss this. No, I think the core thing when speaking out is it has to be about empowerment. And then we get into the other sort of thing that we don't touch. So it's very hard to say to a company like a bank, well, your target is 8, let's lower it to 4. Nobody in compliance can do that. Hardly anybody in the C-suite can do that. So that's why it's so hard. If we're talking about speaking out, sure, there are things you control. Do you respond when people speak out? Great, that's in your game. But do people actually feel they can speak out? And then you're talking about empowerment. In some contexts, you're then talking about unions. Can you imagine that in the US? Somebody in compliance going to Starbucks or whatever other company. I read Benjamin's book, and in order to prevent our next sort of big scandal, we need to have unions. Again, it's a big, big, big thing that goes beyond. But I do think that's the deeper underlying sort of issue. What I mean by organizing your own critique, it means also empowering people that they can actually speak out. And in the new book, I sort of show the different mechanisms through which silencing happens. It's not just saying, oh, there's a bad culture. It's a number of organizational mechanisms that organizations come to develop, including not responding, including having very complex sort of risk that people don't understand. So then you need to teach them about the risks. So we talk about Chernobyl, for instance. People who made that fatal decisions in that control room, they didn't know about the 16 structural faults in the design of reactor 4 they were working on because they had never been informed. So it also means sharing more information, which is also very hard to do. Organizations like to compartmentalize. And finally, people at some point seeing retaliation, or fearing retaliation, or seeing others don't speak out, just simply are not empowered. And then you need to work on that. And that, yes, you can use the word culture on that, but I think it's very specific, practical things we're talking about, some of which are just very hard to do.
So if that's on the incentive side, I know a huge body of the work that you've done is around punishment. So if we're thinking of ourselves leaders and we've got a carrot or a stick, and perhaps the carrot's a bit too excessive in that case, but what about the stick? Is there a fear that if we put the stick in place, that's going to prevent things like innovation, for example, or are they successful? I'd be really interested to hear your views.
The behavioral code, once you finish reading it, you'll see that punishment has all kinds of effects. And I have a new paper coming out. It's already online. I posted it on LinkedIn, and it's on the different behavioral effects, the potential behavioral effects of punishment. And it's coming out in a journal, academic journal soon. But I was just, before this conversation, reading the proofs. And we recognize at least 13 different effects of punishment. And of these, let me just check what I had in the latest version. Sorry, because these things change sometimes how we count things. 1 second, I'm just
Yeah,
going.
let's get it right, Benjamin. I don't want out of date information on my podcast.
Exactly. So of these, we see that there is 5 that are potentially positive. So you can think of things like specific deterrence. So that means somebody who's punished won't do it again. General deterrence. If you hear somebody else being punished, you won't do it. Incapacitation means that the punishment itself makes it impossible for you to engage in the act. So in the corporate sphere, we can think of a license being revoked as part of a punishment, and you cannot actually operate in the market. We have rehabilitation, and then we have ending impunity on the positive side. And that's an important one. So I think not punishing does come with downsides. And one downside is that it signals it's okay to engage in the behavior. We have all kinds of things on the negative side. So for instance, by having a punishment, as you said, it may lead to a sort of cat and mouse game where people will just try and be innovative in evading, in not getting caught. And I saw a lot of that during my PhD research on the polluting industry in China. You may also see that it can, for instance, crowd out positive norms. So people already, they want to do the right thing. They have been doing the right thing, but now they see that there's punishment coming in, and they think, oh, I should only be doing the right thing if there's punishment. If there's no punishment, I can do whatever I want. So there's different effects for which we have different literatures. And I think the practical implication of this is make sure you understand which of these effects are relevant for your case when you want to introduce punishment, and that you introduce punishment in such a way that it doesn't activate the negative and it does activate the positive. So to give one example of a current study we're doing, we're looking at minor insurance fraud that ordinary citizens do. What if the government has a campaign saying, well, still a lot of people, for instance, when they go on holiday and their camera is broken, they may report it as being stolen. They may send a deterrence message, and the deterrent message from the government may be, look, there's a big problem that a lot of people falsely report their stuff on holiday being stolen. We caught many of them and they've been punished. That's supposed to send a signal of deterrence, which it may well do, but it has a hidden signal of a lot of people are doing it. So what we're doing in this study is A, to check whether both these signals are happening, B, how they affect each other. Is the social norm that a lot of people are doing this, which is negative, is it stronger than the deterrence message? And once we find this out, we then want to, and suppose we're right that both these effects are there and that the negative effect of the social norm is significant, then we want to see, can we still have a deterrent message without the negative social norm? For instance, by giving an example of one person getting punished rather than many people got punished. Can we still, with that, get people to think that it's very likely that they will get punished while not having them think, oh, it's very normal, everybody's doing this? So that's a very specific sort of things we can do.
It might be more powerful then if there's one person being prosecuted than the idea that there's hundreds of them, and therefore, well, maybe we can do it as well.
Well, we're not sure. So the evidence for deterrence, so we know, and this is also discussed in the behavioral code, we know that the certainty of punishment is really vital. So to enhance the certainty of punishment, you have to think, okay, it's likely that I will get caught. So then having a single person as an example may not reflect to people that they will get caught. Maybe somebody else got lucky. So this is something that we're testing. We know the best message for certainty of punishment is to show everybody's getting caught. But we also know that's very likely to activate this social norm that we don't want. So that's the sort of practical things you can do once you figure out what, for your case, are the sort of potential effects of punishment. The problem in reality is, and this isn't just in companies, it's even more so with lawmakers. If I look at debates about ordinary criminal law, but also sanctions against companies, I don't see anybody ever thinking about what are the potential effects of punishment. They largely only talk about deterrence in a very simplistic way. So this is the thing that we're trying to do, is to get people to broaden the type of questions that they're asking about this. And that's, I think, where as an academic I can help. I cannot help with the answers, but I can help with asking broader questions.
I think it's more than that, because I think the body of work that you've created around how laws influence human behavior, for example, I mean, it'd be great to get into that, because I think leaders can apply insights from that work that you've done into how they foster compliance within their own organizations. So, yeah, tell us a bit more about that. So, how laws, I suppose, influence and shape behavior rather than punishment.
Sure. So punishment is an intervention that activates a whole number of mechanisms. And my thinking is always about, let's flip the side to this. So that's the most important message I always have is, don't go at this just from your intervention. So I think what we have in companies, if you're in compliance, you have a bunch of interventions. You have your code, the rules you can write, you have your training so you can organize, you have your sort of reporting mechanisms, and maybe there's internal sanctions. I'm just summarizing a couple of examples. I flip it around. I say, okay, let's understand the root causes of this behavior here. What were the sort of mechanisms at play? And there I would start normally with what enabled the behavior to exist anyway. So that's very practical. So you then don't ask why it happened, you ask how it happened. And if you understand the how, you may be able to cut out one of the necessary conditions for the behavior to happen. And in the book, there's a lot of examples of this. So everybody knows the examples in traffic where we have speeding, we have speed bumps. We all know, if we think a bit deeper, examples that we have on terrorism. I mean, we're not trying to deter a suicide bomber. What we're trying to do is make it impossible that people smuggle liquids on a plane that may explode. Because that sort of thinking would be step one. How does it happen? And there's a step zero, which is a sort of what types of behavior am I looking at? Because often we conflate one behavior that we think is one type, but there may be different types. So an extreme example is homicide, which is one legal category, but a passion killing is completely different in motivations and situations than a organized hit by the mafia. So you first have to split up your behaviors to understand, okay, which one am I actually looking at? Then you go through, okay, what enables it? After that, you only get to the motivations. And with the motivations, the next question you want to ask is, what do people see as common behavior here? And what do they see as acceptable here? That gives you a lot of information about the social norm. If you don't understand the social context within your organization on how the behavior is viewed, if you then go and intervene into it, for instance, with punishment, it may completely backfire. As the example I gave earlier, you may be activating a negative social norm. Or there may be a positive social norm where a lot of people actually are against corruption. Well, you just have to activate that rather than going into it with a sort of incentive-based intervention. So with all these things, it's about the bottom line into these questions is, first of all, how can you make it harder to do the behavior? Second, how can you get a deeper intrinsic motivation for the behavior that you actually want? And there, the sort of interventions we normally have, they may work or they may not work. But you sort of have to look at from the root causes to then say, okay, what intervention fits with this? Some of the things we have fit with it, some don't. And there it gets tricky because obviously the interventions we have, we're not going to do away with, because they serve at least one function, which is they're part of what is seen a robust compliance management system. So you need them for your liability management anyway. And that's where it gets harder. That sort of what we do was never designed to change behavior. It was designed from an idea of what a good system would look like that was never based on evidence. And that's what I find so hard. What most people do in their everyday work serves a really important function. It's there because it should be there, given the rules that exist, or at least the incentives that exist on organizations. But it's not there necessarily by design because it works best.
No, and I often think that some of the things we do, not just in compliance, but in the law generally, are about avoiding litigation for the corporation we're acting for, rather than actually making a difference in how people behave or do things, or actually as a deterrent or whatever.
Yes. And I've thought a lot about that. My ideas have evolved over time. I used to think we have compliance 1.0, which is liability management. And then we have compliance 2.0, which is behavioral change. And I would contrast them. So liability management, that's all exposed. The behavior has happened. And we want to make sure we're sort of predicting the future. If something bad happens, are we going to be liable? How do we reduce liability? And I used to frame this as sort of old-fashioned and bad. And we need to move to behavioral change. And I think that's sort of where the more innovative or front edge organizations are. I've changed a bit in my thinking about this. I don't think liability management is ever going to be not there. And it is a very valid concern. It's something that needs to be done. And I think if we fail to recognize its position and its existence, we're never going to be able to do anything else because we're going to run against the same roadblock time and time again. It's also the most sellable thing for why compliance or legal exists. It's much harder to prove that behavioral change actually can happen, and even harder to show what value it does to the organization. So my sort of view has changed a bit, and I see sort of compliance 1.0 the same. I see this compliance 2.0, which is a sort of, in my eyes, a sort of flat application of behavioral insights, sort of the nudge type insights, sort of the psych insights. If I press A, I get B. And I see a compliance 3.0, where I hope to be, which is more of a complex view, which says, look, in the end, we need to combine liability management while also trying to, as much as possible, prevent really bad harm to happen. However, there's no simple solution to the really bad harm not happening. There's no simple science we can apply. There's no single button we can apply. We need to embrace that. We need to understand the underlying causes that could be there and see to what extent, in a conversation with people higher in an organization, we can address some of these. We have to find win-win situations. And then you get to very different things, such as, can we actually develop a longer-term perspective on our business? Which may sound very exotic, but that solves a lot of things in one go. If you're only looking at the everyday, day-to-day bottom line, then the sort of safety or sort of prevention of bad behavior becomes opposed to the business concern. But if you have a longer term perspective, at some point they become the same. Boeing cannot survive without safe planes. So in the longer run, there is no conflict of interest. And then that creates a lot more space to then say, okay, let's look at these underlying causes and let's discuss them and see how we can combine liability management with reduction of these long-term risks. But that's a different thing from, let's say, we're trying to shape everybody's behavior the whole time. Because the other part of this, and Todd Howe's work, who's at Indiana at university, he's looked at sort of what he calls the power distribution of compliance. The worst behaviors, they don't come from your average employee. They are always going to be exceptional. And I think a lot of the sort of science that has been used on this, sort of the nudge type stuff, it's based on the idea that all these small type of transgressions add up to really bad losses for a company. And that's in a sense true. But if I look at the worst case that I'm studying now, they're more on the exceptional side. So you have to look at other sort of risks to be able to prevent them. And then you do get back to the things I said earlier, such as the targets, not being able to speak out, etc. And those things can be integrated, I think, into a liability-based program as well.
Do you accept then? I think something I've always held, this is not based on research, obviously, it's just a sort of observation, is that most people want to do the right thing. However, you always get the bad apple or whatever.
It's not my frame. I don't believe in good and bad people. I've seen too much of bad people, or sorry, horrible acts where there's really normal people involved. I mean, that whole frame comes out of certain kinds of behavioral economics, behavioral ethics, that sort of want to understand, why does everybody engage in unethical behavior? Fine, great, you can look at all that. Well, what am I interested in? Companies like Monsanto that bring chemical after chemical after chemical, where there's 40 years of evidence within the company of the massive harm that it causes. Organizations like the Catholic Church, where we get parish after parish after parish, where we see the same abusive behaviors. Like USA Gymnastics, where we get coach after coach after coach. In the same organizations like HSBC, where we see years and years of money laundering in Mexico, working with the worst cartels. In those instances, at some point in the organizations, look, there is really clear knowledge of horrible outcomes by multiple people. I'm not judging them to be bad or good. What I'm interested in, what were the organizational processes that made this? So I don't believe you can ever have an organization without individuals, I'm not going to qualify them, who might be engaged in harm, whether for good reasons or bad reasons. So I don't think you can fully not have those individuals. I don't think you can have organizations without bad leaders. There's going to be some bad leaders. What I'm interested in is, how do you harness organizations to reduce the sort of effects of these individuals? And I think we've been too focused on the individual and on sort of the average individual and the average sort of smaller sorts of harm, smaller unethical behaviors, and not enough on the worst case. That's why my new book only focuses on the worst cases. I'm pretty sure most of the listeners to the podcast are not in organizations like that. I'm pretty sure they don't want to be in organizations like that. So I think we can learn from those organizations on what we don't want to become. And that's what I'm trying to do right now.
Because it's really providing a lot of red flags for people when they're in their own leadership roles, of what they can look out for, or if they see behaviors like this, that would indicate it's a really dark path.
Yes. And I wouldn't say behaviors, I would say organizational processes. And sure, there's people and behaviors behind that. So as I mentioned earlier, goal setting, silencing, then we also have opportunities for harmful conduct, which isn't just, oh, I make it easy for people to bribe. No, sometimes it's because of your skill. So a lot of times I find the success of an organization also enables it to engage in extreme harm. I mean, why is a Boeing aircraft, if there's a problem in it, so harmful? Because they have 42% of commercial aircraft. So if they have a design flaw, it's really bad. That's not something that anybody made them do. It's a good thing. It's a good thing that they have been so successful. But with that success comes an extra risk. So if you add that up to the unrealistic targets in silencing, the scale of operation is another one. If you're in a very large scale, or if you're engaged in the sort of products that have a very high likelihood, if something goes wrong, to have a really harmful effect. For instance, if you're a bank being involved in the interbank interest rates, like in the LIBOR case, you have an effect on trillions of dollars. So it's those things, if you recognize that you're there. So those types of processes. So an organization has a skill, and because of the skill, it has an effect. And that's what I'm calling on, because I think some of what we've been doing in Compliance 2.0 has been too simple in the individual behavior. And to be honest, I think the behavioral code, my last book, is more in that line, and there's a lot to learn there. But I really believe the organizational processes is where the deeper level is. I'm sorry to talk about something I haven't published yet.
No, I know, it's exciting though. I can't wait for it now. So if the book that you're about to release is identifying the red flags, and presumably it's identifying steps that leaders can take to avoid those situations, does it also help around mitigation as well? So once you've discovered this issue or it's come to light, then are, are there thoughts around how you might sort of mitigate that damage, I suppose, for want of a better word?
I wish I had that already. I mean, I'm always better at analyzing problems.
Yeah, you did say that, to be fair. It's not about the solution. You did say.
I mean, that's the academic in me. It's also because every time I see a solution, I can analyze it in a way to show its flaws. That's how I've been trained. So the book, what it does after each chapter, it goes back to a reader who is in a normal organization, not a toxic organization. So it gives them the questions exactly on what to look for. I think diagnosing risk early is the most important thing. If you're aware of this early, you can nip it in the bud before it becomes so deeply normalized, which is another chapter, into an organization. And yes, we do talk in the end about sort of the detox. The final chapter is called the detox. And it's not easy once it's really deeply set in. And we do also talk about the context. So organizations don't exist in a vacuum. So we talk about the broader market. We talk about broader societal forces and also governmental regulatory forces. Because it's sometimes too easy to just tell, I cannot tell a company, just reduce your targets. Obviously, that's a quick fix. But very obviously, I mean, we've seen if then suddenly your stock price goes, if you lose your company value by half, simply because somebody tells you there's a red flag that I cannot prove will lead to harm. I cannot. I can only show other instances where it proved harm. I could never convince a leader in a company to get based on that to reduce the value of their company so much. So it's more of a conversation, I think, around these themes.
I was just going to say they can really help with the design, though, can't they, of your policies, of your procedures, of all the things that you as a leader really need to be on top of.
Well, I would say even at a higher level. So the policies and those things are in the compliance level. There's a level above that. So I saw this also at the big compliance conference where you heard me speak. People talked about incentives, and I said we need to talk about the targets because the incentives only serve to serve targets. And I saw through that really clearly where our mind is. It's in the incentives, which we sort of can tinker with from compliance or from legal, but we're not thinking about the elephant in the room, which is the targets. No, I think the bigger level design is if we understand, as I said earlier, sure, you're at Wells Fargo, mid 1990s. Somebody comes up with this idea of 8 products per client. Okay, you're in compliance or in legal or in risk. You're telling them it's not a good idea. In basis, I heard a rule from a general counsel who said you have to tell leadership 80% yes and 20% no. Otherwise, they're not going to listen. So probably this is not going to be a 20% no thing because they're not going to listen. This is their big thing. But you have to tell them, you can tell them that, look, this is a risk. In order to mitigate the risk, what you need to do, as I said earlier, is to make sure at least we organize a very good channel for people to speak out, that we understand when things go off the rails with these targets, and also a willingness to adapt them if this happens. So I think in the design phase, you have to go a little bit higher than incentives towards those targets and say, fine. First of all, say there are certain risks here. The same can apply, for instance, if you're going to engage in a large enlargement that enlarges your scale, or you're going to be involved in a very risky product that has very high risk if you're not organized in the right way. Again, you can say, fine if we do that, but maybe we do so in a lower target, or maybe we do so in a way that we organize our sort of own resistance. If things go wrong, that people can speak out. So it's that balance. If you see, however, unfortunately, that's what toxic organizations look like, that all the flags are in the red, then it's also very unlikely you can convince anybody to lower one of these flags.
Yeah, and that's also something I've seen time and time again with an acquisition. So if one company buys, the culture of the first company might be okay, but if the company
Yep.
with the second culture is pretty toxic, then suddenly that becomes the norm. It just seems to sink rather
Yep.
than lift.
Yep. And that's the
Um,
Boeing McDonnell Douglas case. It's very interesting. Boeing bought McDonnell Douglas, but McDonnell Douglas sort of took over the culture and the board. This is really, really well documented in the book on Boeing, Flying Blind. It's a great book.
Thank you. And it's so interesting hearing you talk because obviously I've seen the quotes where you say that, your desire to unleash a behavioural revolution in the law. And I did wonder what, if you could elaborate on that and the significance of it, but I feel like you touched on it already, but
No, that is a different thing. So when you ask me about what should organizations do, you just heard me how I respond. If you ask me what should we do in law, so I do see that law is the most important human-made system of behavioral modification. And I know saying it in that way is really disrespecting a lot of things of law. People call me an instrumentalist. But I would say even the highest lofty values of law have to do with this. What is the rule of law in the end? It means that law is the higher authority that is putting meaningful restraints on government action. What are meaningful restraints if not restraints on the behavior of government? So law in one of its essential functions, even courts, I could look at that, even dispute resolution. Why are you resolving disputes? Because there has been damaging behavior. Part of the outcome should be that that behavior doesn't happen again, or that it stops. So at least part of what law does is behavioral modification. And there, as you've seen, probably I write, isn't it strange that we let the training and the design and the execution of law largely to people who have not studied behavior? And that I find fascinating. And that's where I do see there are things we can do. One is legal education. So I think legal education, we need to include more in getting lawyers not only to be able to do sound legal analysis, but also sound analysis of behavior. That includes both the behavior within the law, how the law is applied, made, enforced, as well as the effects of the law on human and organizational conduct. And in Amsterdam, we have such a course that we have in the first year law curriculum compulsory. So it's an undergraduate law degree. I mean, where it starts. So we get the 18-year-olds, they've had half a year of legal training. They have their little legal glasses on. They make their legal analysis. They have their legal sources, legal analysis. And then they get to do my class and I take the glasses off again. They hate it. They don't like this because it's very comfortable. Finally, they can speak like a lawyer. And we teach them how to read empirical evidence, how to critique empirical evidence, how to apply empirical evidence about the ways law interacts with human conduct. So I think that's a very important one. The second I would say is make empirical questions about the effect of law and behavior part of what you see as legal research. So a lot of people tell me, oh, what you're doing is not legal. They're not legal questions. My response is, why not? If we in law are saying, well, those are social science questions, they're not us, I think we're giving a space away that we should also be in. Sure, so social scientists study it, but they study it for different reasons. They want to understand what the meaning is of capital punishment for society. But I think from a legal point of view, if we're not saying that the question of what the effect of law is on behavior, if we're saying that's not a legal question, I mean, a legal research question, I think we're giving up a whole domain where we should be. And once we say that is part of who we are in research, it also means we have to enhance our skills there, which means we need to get a lot of people inside law or better skills inside or better collaborations with the people in social science to actually answer this. So I think those are the vital things. I think for practice, we also see, I think the future of practice includes interdisciplinarity. So if you want to be a successful corporate lawyer, you have to understand how to get things done. That means at some point that either you collaborate with regulators, you have to understand how they're thinking. If you're negotiating with the other business on a contract, you want to get compliance on the contract. That's not just how you write it down. You don't want to end up in court. So again, there's behavior there. And finally, obviously, for compliance management. So I think there is this interdisciplinary lawyer that could function much better if that lawyer is trained better, also in practice in human behavior, and if these teams also include some non-legally trained people.
And I think this would particularly be of relevance if you work in-house in a big organization as well. I can really see the application of that. Thinking about future challenges generally as our time together draws to a close, I I wonder, does this also present opportunities, do you think, in the field of compliance? Like, I'd like to think that we'd end on a more positive note than we can see, some sort of constructive help from this book and other studies that you've done where it might present opportunities.
So I see a lot of opportunities. So first of all, I think we generally need to have a redesign of what we see as a standard toolkit of compliance. And that redesign should be one that combines liability management with actually sort of looking at the endemic underlying causes. That cannot be done without a successful convincing of people, for instance, in the DOJ, to change the federal sentencing guidelines, sort of directives that guide a lot of this. And that's part of a conversation I'm hoping to engage with once we have a level of people there that want to listen to that. And I'm not commenting on anything else on that now. But I do think already companies can themselves start with this. So I think that's one thing. It's really about the design without saying, oh, we abandon liability management, or we're going to have miracles in changing everybody's behavior, or we're going to do A/B testing of everything and do experiments. I don't think that's the way out. I think it has to really be about the basic design of saying, okay, what are the sorts of prioritized risks that we really want to focus on in prevention? All the other stuff is going to be liability management. So sure, we need a boilerplate liability management system. Fine. But on top of that, you want to build you want to prioritize what are the things that would threaten the very survival of our organization if they happen, and the sort of behavioral risks. For those, you can actually do get support, probably by saying, okay, we add a layer to the liability management that actually is preventative, where we are looking at the underlying causes. So I think there's great opportunities there, which is a little bit different from what I'm seeing now, which is sort of saying we do liability management and then we do behavioral change for everybody. And what you then end up with is the small stuff for everybody. And then everybody gets a training and everybody has to do a code and you make everybody's life a little bit worse without being sure you do anything. What I'd rather have is us saying, and I think there is an opportunity there because it is new work and it's more fun work, I think, to do. Also makes people's role more valued, I think, because you're not bothering everybody. Because you're probably then looking at sort of risks that are not involving every employee and are not sort of rolling out massive systems that are very time consuming and just annoying, I think, where we can't prove that they're doing much. So I think that's where the opportunity lies.
And it's moving from that liability point again, isn't it? Back to actually helping the business, changing behavior or guiding behaviors or whatever. So,
But it means that you have
mm,
to think strategically. It also means that you have to allow in your mind, which we're not going to like, sure, there's going to be other bad things happening, which we're not going to be addressing. It means making choices. And I think the choice we've implicitly made now, well, let's just do the stuff we can do, which is the lower hanging fruit that is sort of annoying and we're not sure what it does. So the sort of things I've talked with people about are often about the minor things we can measure. So the most sophisticated behavioral teams I've seen, they focus on expense account declaration problems, for instance, or on compliance with participating in training, which I find the most ridiculous example because then it becomes compliance. What do they do? Ensure compliance with compliance. That's not why we exist. We exist because if things go really wrong, we don't want that. So we need to define the really wrong first.
it's completely rational when you put it that way.
I know.
Of
I know that. So it's a paradigm shift. And I'm saying this paradigm shift is an opportunity. Look, to be honest, I've talked with too many people in compliance when I'm at dinners or other things, and they sort of become a therapy sessions. They ask me, so Benjamin, is our work actually valuable? Do we actually achieve something? Because they want to sort of get me to say, well, scientifically, yes.
validate it, yeah.
I can't. I'm sorry. that's also the way science works. Science doesn't validate whatever somebody's doing. I mean, human behavior is way too complex for that. So what my normal answer is, do you like your work? Often the answer is yes. I'd say, well, great. That's very, very important. Do people appreciate you? Yeah, they do. Great. What I hope at some point, and this is what I hope that happens with the paradigm shift, is if we can really get all these wonderful people who've joined this great field to prioritize the work on larger risks while still doing the liability management. And sure, the liability management will have annoying bits, but you can tone it down to such a level where you're no longer creating expectations that this will do behavioral change. Just as, okay, look, you want us to do X, Y, and Z as a regulator, fine, we'll do it. You asked us, we'll do it. But we're also going to focus on these deeply risks that we ourselves see, that we're proactively going to pursue. I think people will get more meaningful jobs, have both the sort of run-of-the-mill things they need to do with creative work and complex work that might actually reduce these bigger risks that exist. I think that's the sort of combination of the old compliance 1.0 and getting rid of the compliance 2.0, which I think was a bit flat.
And now to your new 3.0.
If we want to use that term, yes.
You did. I'm going with
I know.
it. If you had one thing, I mean, obviously, your career is already amazing, but it's going to progress. I can see you've got a lot of work to do and you want to do. But if there was one, I guess, reflecting on your career so far and the future work you want to do, what legacy would you hope to leave, do you think, in this field of law and behavioural science? Let's narrow it down to that.
Wow. That's a difficult one. I would love to have the legacy that my research and the work I've collaborated with others gives people better insight on how to look at law and behavior from a root cause analysis point of view. So the root causes. If you ask me what would I still like to do in the future, I am now at a crossroads where at some point I would love to be involved on an actual complex big case. So actually be involved. Let's take any really major scandal. I'd love to be involved, for instance, in a monitor team that would really try and address the root causes and really be on that side. Yeah. Or another legacy, I mean, if you're asking me, pipe dream sort of thing, get the sort of top influential regulators such as the DOJ to change their sort of requirements of liability management type stuff towards that more structural big harm type of underlying causes interventions. Because then you can get rid of the stuff that we all are doing that we're not sure does anything. So that's another thing, is to really get some traction there. And I know how hard it is because there's a whole political side to that. Which I mean, actually, literally a sort of popular political side. Any scandal happens, the regulators or the prosecutors all have to say, how do we find the highest person or the biggest fine? And that's what we do, set that signal, rather than say, okay, what actually happened here? What were the deeper causes? How does punishment now help this? What other things should we be doing? I'd love to be able to get a change on that. That's one of the reasons I wrote the behavioral code and now the new book Toxic, towards a general audience, not just the people listening here, a popular general audience, because the end problem is in the political realm. And we need to have storytelling, bringing sort of these scientific and other insights into a discourse that makes it very easy for people to understand and maybe even fun to talk about. I believe that's the only way to get a beginning of change.
Absolutely. And it brings the whole thing to life for everyone. So then you have that body of opinion that pushes the political agenda as well. So I absolutely think the wider audience is the way to go. I so enjoyed our conversation. It's been brilliant and really different and dynamic. Thank you so much. I've one last question I ask everyone. If you could create a leader's survival kit, what would you put in it?
Interesting question. I said earlier, realism. I mean, I can say this sort of, if I had a pill for people to have realism and the courage to push back and organize your own sort of resistance, it will be things like that. I think it has much more to do with traits such as patience, traits such as having enough self-confidence to listen to things that you don't agree with, being situational, where you don't always respond the same way, but actually respond to the way that you should. And these are not things I could say, oh, survival kit, read this book. I mean, a book is not going to do it. So I don't know how that would work in a kit. It probably also needs the right people there.
Well, I think in a way that's what this podcast is all about, is to equip people with information and points of view that maybe push their own way of thinking so that they can actually have the confidence to push back on things that ultimately won't give us the results we're looking for.
Maybe their survival kit would have a magical glasses that could show the effect of their actions in 20 years.
Oh, now that I like. I think that's my favourite so far, Benjamin. Thank you. It's been such a pleasure. Let's go with the magical glasses. And let's hope if we have another conversation, maybe we won't leave it 20 years, but that we'll be able to see the effects of your new book as well, which I'm really looking forward to. And thank you for sharing and giving us some insights into what it's about.
Well, thanks for having me here, Sarah.
That's it for today's episode of Insights from the Coalface, Elevating Leadership Beyond the Boardroom. I hope this conversation left you with fresh insights, new perspectives, and a deeper connection to the challenges and opportunities of leadership. If you found value in today's discussion, I'd love for you to share it with your network, leave a review, or reach out to me with your thoughts. Leadership can be a lonely road, but it doesn't have to be. Let's keep learning, growing, and supporting each other. Until next time, stay resilient, stay authentic, and keep leading with purpose.